Well, they say that discretion is the better part of valour. I tried peeling up the leather at this end of the camera to see if I could strip it back to get to those Zeiss bumps, but the leather started to crack all the way across in the 2 or 3 attempts I made to get under it with a scalpel. So I know that that leather is very brittle, and I know that my chances of getting that peeled back to the point where I can deal with these ugly Zeiss bumps is virtually nil. I would have to replace that piece of leather entire if I was going to achieve anything useful there. So I'm just going to see if I can improve the look of this leather slightly with a bit of colour. So I'm just checking. I've got a laundry marker pen here, and I'm going to see if that will colour that leather fairly well. First, I'm just going to use some naphtha on a cotton bud, wipe over the leather to remove any oils or greases so that I've got the leather down to a clean state. What I'm most interested in here is whatever colour I add to that leather, I want it to soak in so that it stays there, not wipes off. Alright, let's have a look at this. So all I'm doing is dotting some black marker. This is a laundry marker. I found that these tend to leave a matte black finish. A lot of marker pens leave a purpley shiny finish, and all I'm doing is dotting this into any spots that are where the colour's gone completely, where it's rubbed right through, and I'm doing this in a fairly random fashion. It's never going to be absolutely invisible if you look closely enough. All we're trying to do here is improve the look of it so that it doesn't have that mottled leopard skin effect that it previously had. And the leather, of course, has gone completely at that point. I'll just blacken the body there so you can't see. There's a bit of shine to this pen, but it's nowhere near as bad as marker pens typically are. And here we do the same on these high spots where the surface of the leather is actually rubbed right through there, that the embossed pattern is just gone. This is a very well loved camera, I'd say. This is not a facelift procedure, it's more like a Botox procedure. The base of the camera I'll deal with later because I've got to glue that back down once everything else is done. So I'll find some polish now and we'll see how this comes out. Right. Well, I've got two different polishes here that I've found useful. This one here, Wapru Renovating Polish, natural waxes. It smells a bit, this stuff. Made in Australia, it tells me. I don't know whether it's available in other parts of the planet. It's a very soft wax. It's absolutely chocker with pigment. It's very good for blackening leather, and I'll use that in this case because this leather is somewhat devoid of colour. The reason I don't use this all the time for every job is that it smells. I don't know what it is it smells of, but it's Got quite a distinct odour to it. So if I don't think it's required, I don't use it. I would use that other polish, which is far more neutral in its odour. But this is particularly good at applying colour to the leather. That's all that's required. Now let's give it a little rub to take away any excess and to clean any of the body edges too. You don't want the wax on those particularly. Alright, well there's the camera back. Obviously we've still got our ice bumps, but they are somewhat disguised now, being the same colour as everything else. And our two front panels are likewise looking much better. So they look like this to start with. Now they're just black, unremarkable apart from the ice bumps on the back of the camera here. So once the base of the camera, the camera's been put back together and this has been glued down, I'll treat this in the same way. I would expect the same result. Alright, it's some indeterminate time later. I'll be able to check the timings on the camera files and tell you that possibly. I've had everything out of here. The struts have all come out of the camera, been cleaned up, straightened up, put back. Likewise the focus helical's been cleaned, lubricated, everything's working nicely. I straightened up this piece here, the coupling for the rangefinder, and the focus is now smooth and works through its entire range without any hesitation. So that was our major problem here, was the focus. I still haven't decided exactly how it came to be messed up. Most likely something prevented the pin at the top here from being able to move forward while the focus was adjusted to the forward position, effectively bending this arm backwards. The most likely candidate for doing that would be that the rangefinder was stuck. This piece pulls the rangefinder arm forward as you adjust it to the close focus position. If the rangefinder was stuck, that would stop that pin from moving, which would effectively lead to this arm becoming bent if the focus was forced at that point. It's difficult to see how the rangefinder could be so stiff that it could achieve that. Another possibility is that a screw came loose in the camera and was lodged in this slot, physically preventing that post from moving far enough forward, and so achieving the same thing as if the rangefinder was jammed. There was no loose screw in here, of course. I know that a screw was missing from the camera, but it was missing from the outside of the top cover. It's difficult to see how a screw could fall loose out of the outside of the top cover and then find its way into the camera and cause us grief. So it remains speculation as to what the cause was. I suppose it doesn't really matter in the great scheme of things. The problem has been fixed. I will continue on with cleaning and reassembling the camera, and hopefully it'll be all nice and tidy and ready to go home sometime later today. just reaching the point in the repair. I've got the camera fairly well advanced in reassembly. Reaching the point in the repair where I want to look at the advance lever. Now the advance lever is obviously missing its leather cover from the top there. That piece of leather is missing. There's a dent in the advance lever at this point. I don't believe that would cause me any problems. I may have mentioned earlier that the frame counter was set incorrectly. There's one notch here the job that does is it locks the advance when it reaches number 1. There are 2 positions that the number plate can be, the frame counter disc can be fitted. If it's fitted the wrong way, instead of locking at number 1, it locks diametrically opposed to number 1, around about 21 or 22, which is exactly what it was doing. Excuse me. As I went to reassemble this lever, I just replaced the rubber pad here because that was shot. I noticed that this spring washer was missing. Normally that sits in there. That would apply some upward pressure, which would help keep all these components correctly engaged. And I suspect because that was missing, probably as a result of a previous repair, that's how this disc came to be 180 degrees out from where it should be. So I've pretty much got a full set of parts there to go. I've got to create a leather patch for the top of this lever, and I've got a piece of leather here that's suitable. That's obviously come from a Retina IIa or IIa camera. You can see the cutout for the strap lug there. This piece of leather is torn at the edge, so it's effectively a bit ugly to reuse for that purpose again anyway. So what I'll have to do is I'll cut out of this piece here, I'll cut a patch to go into this, to cover the top of that lever, and hopefully everything will look nice and pretty again. So that's what I've got to achieve. Alright, I've got my leather patch created, and I want to blacken the edges of that leather so that they don't stand out. The leather here is probably thicker than the original piece would have been, but hopefully that won't cause me any problems. I don't want to have to skive the leather, thin it out to make it because that's a bit of an act doing that. It takes some skill. Here we go. So those edges are nicely blackened, and I'll just glue that into place, and it'll be just like I bought one. That's my next task, is to glue that in, and then I can fit the advance lever on the top of the mechanism as it's currently assembled, and check the action of the film advance before I continue on with the rest of the repair. I still have to clean the rangefinder, clean up the top cover, and check the shutter release components for the body as well, and finally I will strip and service the shutter and lens assembly and add them back to the body. Alright, I've got the film advance lever reassembled. The frame counter spring failed basically as soon as I'd reassembled this, and on investigating why this should be, I see that there's a lot of scarring on the top of the film advance at this point, and this piece is actually pushed in. It's crushed down, and that in turn creates a lot of friction at this point, and that friction would have led to the tip of the spring flexing to a greater extent as it pushes the frame counter around, and that in turn would cause metal fatigue and cause it to snap at the hinge point. So this top piece here, I'll see if I can straighten it up, but if I can't straighten it up to my satisfaction, I'll replace that piece. It's definitely out of shape. Well, that was definitely the answer. The frame counter works very smoothly now. No undue resistance or friction. And so that misshapen top piece here that has been encouraged back into shape with judicious use of hammers is fine to continue going. But I would say that the damage there is the explanation for that spring, that wavy washer being missing from underneath the mechanism. Somebody previously, when they were repairing it, they left that washer out in order to lessen the friction at this point that had been caused by this damage. So they'd fixed the problem, but they'd fixed the problem the wrong way. They treated the symptom instead of the cause. Anyway, that's fit to go on with. So now at this point I need to just put back my shutter release components back into the body and clean up the rangefinder and clean up my top cover. Well, I'm well advanced with putting the shutter back together, and I'm just about to get to the final stages really. And here I have the shutter release lever, the internal shutter release lever from the shutter, and it's twisted. You probably can't see that, but there's quite a twist between the rod on the outside, which I'm holding with my tweezers, and the pivot point on the inside here. So that means it's been, one way or another, accidentally or purposely, that's been twisted out of shape. So I'll have to straighten that up before I put it back into the shutter, and hopefully after that everything will work well and I'll get the shutter back on the camera. Alright, well, the day is nearly done. I have this Retina IIa camera ready to go back to its owner now. I'd say it looks a little bit prettier than it did. And it's all working. That's probably the main thing. What didn't I do? Well, I didn't remove the Zeiss bumps from the back. You can see it's got some very serious warts there. The leather is otherwise looking considerably better. The camera itself mechanically, what was wrong with it? What did it need? Mostly it needed pulling apart and cleaning and servicing. The shutter was failing to cock at 1/500th. Most likely the timing of the cocking rack to the shutter was one tooth out. I think that's probably the biggest influence there. That can be influenced by changes in tolerances over time as parts wear and things no longer push things as quite as far as they used to. No significant problem, and certainly not one that was hard to deal with. The shutter itself certainly needed servicing. Those blades were slightly oily. Nothing too bad there, no great surprises. I did manage to lose the tiny plastic insulator from the flash connection while I was servicing it and had to make a new one. That's fun because it's a tiny plastic slug, about half a... Oh, in fact I've just found it. It's a tiny plastic slug and it's about 0.5 millimetre in diameter and perhaps 1 millimetre long. And I'd misplaced it, but I've just discovered it again. I had to make a new one. And it's just a tiny dot there that you can just about see on the top of the camera. Did I lose it? I've just dropped it again while I'm talking. Oh, there it is. I'll pop that away in the box for another one. It's a very easy thing to lose. It's quite important. If that's not present, you do up the screw, the clamping screw for the flash wire, and you effectively short it to earth so that the flash never works again. So that insulator is quite important. I did notice that it was gone and was able to deal with it. Anything else serious? Well, of course the film advance was a problem. The frame counter wasn't working correctly. The frame counter pull had failed, or is on the verge of it. Certainly it's not worth sending the camera back with that on there. I can tell that's cracked. The root cause of that is that the camera had been dropped on its head. You may or may not see some slight marking on this edge. That's where it had hit the ground. The outcome of that basically was that it was folded down, created too much pressure on the disc below it, which gave it a higher friction than it should have had, and the previous repairer had dealt with that situation by removing the shim spring, the wavy washer spring inside the mechanism to allow more slack. That had allowed the frame counter disc to get 180 degrees out of its normal position, so that it was locking it in the wrong position. Instead of locking when it reached number 1, the counter was locking when it reached 21 or 22. So that missing wavy washer was the root cause of that, and the root cause of the missing wavy washer was that the camera had been dropped on the head and a previous repairer had removed that washer as a way of compensating for the extra pressure that was caused by this damaged top here. And of course the correct procedure would be to sort out the damaged top so that it was no longer creating the extra pressure. The leather patch was missing from the film advance lever. That may or may not have been taken off by the previous repairer when he was delving into the reasons why things weren't working, or it may have just fallen off by itself. That was not uncommon. The adhesive gives up on them and they just fall off and get lost. Anything else of importance? No, not really. Everything has gone well. The rangefinder was not seized up. It was quite stiff, but it was easily cleaned up, lubricated, adjusted, put back. That's all good. The lens itself, the focus of the lens, that was just slightly off, and I dealt with that by removing the quite thick shim that it had here and replacing it with the next one down in series. So they've got about 2 or 3 thicknesses of metal shims, and then there's paper shims of various thicknesses. So simply removing that and replacing it with the thinner shim pulled that infinity focus exactly into position. So the focus is good, the rangefinder is good, the film advance all works correctly. It now cocks the shutter correctly at a 500th every time, and it's ready to go home. Thanks for watching.